So, do you understand what I'm trying to say to you? Using nonverbal communication to start class today? What I'm saying to you is when you go to turn in your discussion posts, you should be carefully proofreading them. Carefully proofreading them to make sure that your sentences are correct. Carefully proofreading them to make sure that you don't have grammar and spelling mistakes. Carefully proofreading them to make sure that you have the right word count. Some of you turning in posts that are way less than 200 words, not giving yourself enough of a chance to do well on the assignment. Others of you are turning in posts way over 200 words, which is giving you an unfair advantage compared to other students. So you've got to stay within the word count to do the post well. And I decided to start class that way to introduce our subject of nonverbal communication. That's what we're talking about today, Chapter 4, Nonverbal Communication. Nonverbal communication plays a big role in intercultural communication. It plays a big role. First of all, let me define it for you. Let me tell you that nonverbal communication is anything other than words used to communicate, the words themselves. Because even words can carry dimensions of nonverbal communication, such as the way that you hit the words, the way that you emphasize them, how long you prolong them, the pauses that you have before you say words. But that's an example of how nonverbal communication permeates our verbal communication as well. But strictly speaking, nonverbal communication is any communication, hand signals, tone, etc. We're going to be talking about that in today's class, other than words. And the reason that nonverbal communication plays such a big role in intercultural communication is because often when we're speaking to other people, they are speaking a different language, even people within our own country. I mean, I have a very hard time understanding hip hop language, so to speak. I have a very hard time understanding younger people's language in general. It's in codes. I have a hard time even understanding emojis sometimes. These are generational differences, and it'll happen to you when you get to be my age as well. I'm trying to communicate with younger generations. And so nonverbal communication can be both a great facilitator. If you really have to express yourself in a foreign language, how to use the bathroom, you can do that much easier by pointing to things. And so nonverbal communication is the subject of our discussion today. Burgoon and Sane, two researchers, they describe nonverbal communication as analogic, or like an analog, as opposed to digital. And what that means is words are discrete entities, right? The word bottle has a beginning and an end, B-O-T-T-L-E. It's discrete, it's over. When that word is over, you know that you're not talking about a bottle anymore. You might be talking about a spoon next, because the word is discrete. Nonverbal communication is not discrete like that. It's not divided up into chopped units. Nonverbal communication is continuous. Throughout this video, you're looking at me to get indications of what material I'm trying to emphasize, hopefully as a tip to you for what to focus on in preparation for your quiz and the discussion posts. And there's no beginning and ending. I mean, I'm constantly moving my hands. Nonverbal communication is analogic. Very interesting. Charles Darwin, I hope you know about Charles Darwin sailing on the HMS Beagle into the Galapagos Islands, among other places, trying to study the idea of evolution, the idea of life changing to adapt to its environment. He actually argued in his research that nonverbal communication is biologically determined, at least some aspects of nonverbal communication. Emotions like anger, disgust, happiness, fear, sadness, surprise, and even contempt, talked about at length by Fred Yant in this chapter, these are all embedded in us from birth, is what Charles Darwin said, which is very strange for a person who's talking about evolution. Darwin said that the reason that it's embedded is because it was a matter of our survival. That when we were approached by somebody who may be hostile and who may kill us or eat us in more primitive days, not necessarily that that's not happening now, but when we're approached by somebody who's unfamiliar and could be perilous to our existence, we look very closely at their facial expressions in particular and their whole manner of the way that they carry themselves to decide whether we need to flee or stand back or guard against danger. Very interesting ideas. Now let's move on to more of the material for the chapter having to do with nonverbal communication. Let's talk about nonverbal communication functions. Like, why do we use nonverbal communication? What is it doing for us? And the first function that nonverbal communication performs for us is replacing spoken messages. Often we are in situations where we can't speak out loud. It would be rude. It would interrupt people speaking. It would reveal things to others that we only want to reveal to certain people. And so we can't talk. It's like when you're in class and the class is running long by the professor You're probably not going to speak up and say, "Excuse me, professor, class has ended." Instead, what you might do is look over at another student like, "Is this for real? Does the professor realize you're going past the class?" You're replacing the message by talking to somebody else. Others might find themselves in a situation when you're in an argument and you end up just walking away from somebody that you no longer want to talk to because you can't really say what you want to it. Maybe it would be too destructive, or maybe you're not sure that you want to say what you want to say. It may just be in the heat of the moment, so you walk away. So that's a good example of replacing spoken messages. Now let's go on to the second function, and that is sending uncomfortable messages. Sending uncomfortable messages, we do this all the time on social media. We send emoji, we send sad faces, we send happy faces. We're trying to, make it easier for others to accept our messages. When we do that, it somehow is easier to let an emoji convey that rather than saying it to somebody directly. Sending uncomfortable messages is not easy. If you have a guest in your house who's staying over and they're not doing the dishes, how do you bring that up? If you talk to them, it may suddenly put a chill into your relationship. So maybe what you do is you leave the dishes for them for a couple days. Maybe you stack them for them. Maybe you put them over closer to where they hang out in the kitchen so that they are invited by that action to clean them up. So we use nonverbals to send uncomfortable messages. We also use nonverbal messages to form impressions that guide our communication later on, like dressing up for a date, putting on your best clothes, making sure that you look as well as you can, you feel as fit as you can. That's trying to set an impression for your date. Or when you meet somebody, the firm handshake, which may or may not exist in a post-pandemic world. Or being on time for a job interview or for a class. These are ways of trying to form impressions that help later on the communication between you. You don't want communication between you and somebody else that's going to be having frustration to it or agitation in most situations. So that's why we often try to form impressions. And then next up, as a function of nonverbal communication, we have making relationships clear. Like when somebody you know is really interested in you and you like them, you're friends with them, but not in the way that they're interested in you. And yet there's an opportunity for you to hug each other. You haven't seen each other for a while, or you're going away from each other, you're leaving each other. So you give a hug and that person pulls you in closer and tighter and wants to hold you longer. And you keep that space of air between you and you give a couple pats on the back. You're sending a clear message there. Hey, the relationship is just one of friendship. It's just one of friendship. A parent crossing the street grabs the child's hand and says, "I'm not letting go of your hand. I don't want you to make a youthful mistake and run into the path of a car. So I'm going to, by holding your hand, say, I'm the parent here. I'm deciding where you're going to walk when we walk across this street." Also, if you're a committee person coming and sitting down at the head of the table, it's all part of making the relationships clear, saying you are the person running the meeting. Next up, as a function of nonverbal communication, is regulating interaction, regulating, controlling the flow, the speed, the pace. If you're talking to somebody who's speaking for too long and you want to make a point and they're not stopping so that you can do that, raise your finger. "Excuse me, I want you to stop talking for a minute. I'd like to say some things myself." Shutting the door on somebody that you're sick of and tired of. Putting that barrier between you and we're not going to talk anymore. The door is between us. Opening your palms. Come on. Explain yourself more. That's a good example of regulating interaction. Don't just stop with what you're saying. Continue on. You have more to say, don't you? And then finally, a function of nonverbal communication is reinforcing and perhaps modifying the verbal messages. I'm going to play golf today. It's one of the things that I enjoy in the summer, and it's a great way to exercise social distance and get some exercise. And I know I'm going to be telling the story to somebody afterwards. I missed a putt by this much, just this much. Okay, would that have as much impact if I'd said, I just missed a putt by 1 centimeter, almost an inch? Does that have as much impact as doing this? I don't know. Actually, a centimeter is more like that. Let's make it really close. That's how close my putt was. Didn't go in the hole. Damn it. So we use nonverbal communication to reinforce messages. My daughter was talking to me about a class that she was taking at Slippery Rock, which was just eating her up. It was a biology class. She did graduate with a GPA of 3.5, so this was one of those classes that was really hard for her and was, against the way she was doing the rest of her school. And when she would describe it to me, she'd be like, she's scratching her hair. All right, now that we're done with functions of nonverbal communication, let's move on to types of nonverbal communication. Different types of nonverbal communication. We have proxemics. First of all, proxemics is the use of space. And I've seen this very different across the world. And a lot of it has to do with our geographical space. The United States is a very big country. And so when you go down an average main street, even like in Stroudsburg, it's really wide. It's actually got 4 lanes in the middle of it. And then you have a huge sidewalk before you get to the stores. We have a lot of space in the United States. And so that also influences how close we feel we should get to each other when we're interacting. And the closeness, the proximity is based on our relationships with others. So in the United States, a lot of the research that's come out on this has shown that we have an intimate zone, which is 18 inches or less. And those are the people that we get that close with, people who we're romantically, intimately involved with, as well as people who we have intimate psychological relationships. And that includes family members, sons, daughters, brothers, uncles, etc. We, generally speaking, allow them in that space. Then there's the personal space. These are people that you have friendly, ongoing relationships with. That's 18 inches to 4 feet apart. Your acquaintances, 18 inches to 4 feet apart. Then next up is the casual space, and that's 4 to 12 feet. And that's with people that you're interacting with, or maybe you're meeting on the quad to throw the frisbee around, or maybe you're going on a bus ride to New York City, and you have some people on the bus who are in the group you've never met before, and they're sitting 12 feet away from you, whether it's the people that you are close to. All of this is changing in the pandemic, has changed in the pandemic, where 6 feet is the standard now. That's the minimum. Unless you're intimate with somebody who does not have the coronavirus, and then that 6 feet goes away. And by the way, there's one more element, and that's public. That's greater than 12 feet. That's, you'd be at a protest, for example, and keeping your space by 12 feet. So proxemics is used very differently. I can just tell you that when you go to Europe, I talk about Europe a lot. That's where the source of a lot of my foreign travel is. And you ride public transportation. It's very common. You get on buses and trains. It's really fun. You don't have to worry about getting in a car. Often the buses and train stops are just down the street corner. We actually have a bus here in Monroe County that's very nice to take. But people sit closer. They get really close to each other. And that happens in the New York subway, right? You get on the New York subway, you have no choice. There's so many people on a small subway. You're holding on to the pole. So it varies across cultures, the use of proxemics. Next up, as a type of nonverbal communication, is kinesics. Kinesics are gestures, body movements, and facial expressions. And these are very different across the world. You can run into some real problems. This means okay in France. This means okay in the United States, the thumb and the forefinger, but in France it means 0. So how are you doing in France? 0? You're not doing well. It's a good example of how a very simple and what we can assume to be a universal gesture in our culture is not so universal. In Greece, it can get much worse. Thumbs up in the US, that's good, right? We use that all the time. Thumbs up in Greece means get fucked, all right? That's a mistake you don't want to make. Japanese people, when they talk about themselves, they point to their faces. Yeah, in the United States, you say, I'm the one who's responsible for this decision. Point to ourselves. Now let's talk about the next type of nonverbal communication, and that is chronemics. That's the use of time. I'm just fascinated by the use of time really anywhere south, getting closer to the equator. Many people are from the Caribbean in this class or have Caribbean ties, so you'll know directly what I'm talking about. But my experience is in Mexico, where the use of time is much more elastic. There's a very funny and famous way of looking at life in Mexico revolving around the word mañana. Even you, if you don't speak Spanish, you know that word mañana, right? It means tomorrow. And tomorrow never means tomorrow. If somebody says they're coming tomorrow, they could come 2 days later, 3 days later, 4 days later. And the reason for that is because the Mexicans, like a lot of people when you get closer to the equator, because the sun is going around in the same orbit all the time, right? We don't have like a northern season where in the winter the sun's very low to the sky and we have shorter hours of daylight. In Mexico, very close to the same all year round, how many hours of daylight. And so there's a view of time that, hey, if 3 o'clock doesn't happen today that we're supposed to get together, no problem. It's like a bicycle wheel. 3 o'clock is coming around again tomorrow. There will be another 3 o'clock. We can meet again at another 3 o'clock tomorrow. Time is very, very elastic in other countries. Now let's move on to paralanguage. Paralanguage is the nonverbal elements of voice. So it's those qualities that accompany the words that you say. And the researcher Traeger in 1961 said there's two elements. There's voice quality, whether you have a shrill voice, a high pitched voice, a grumbly voice, a raspy voice, a steady voice, a scared voice. There's voice quality. And then there's vocalizations. Vocalizations come out when we're speaking. Vocalizations are laughters, they're sobs, they're guffaws, if you know that word. They're the kind of bursts of energy that come out naturally. Those of you who have taken classes in the Department of Communication and have had Wenji Yan or Charlie Warner, both of whom are my friends, particularly Charlie's been a friend of mine for 29 years, they have laughs that shake the whole building. Like, as a chairperson, I know when either one of them is working because I can hear them all the way down the hallway laughing heartily. And I quite admire that they're able to do that, but it's a great example of that second idea of vocalization. And we can say that we can find differences, really big differences around the world. Puerto Ricans, for example, they are known for speaking very softly. They have a very soft manner in the way that they speak. Swedish people, they're known to have a melody. Do you know about the Swedish chef on Sesame Street? Hooda, 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 hoo. It may be too old for you guys at this point, but that's a parody of Swedish people singing when they're speaking. Americans are thought to have a very assertive and sometimes aggressive tone when they're speaking to others from other cultures. Next up, as a type of nonverbal communication, is silence. Silence is not just trying to think of what you want to say and you can't come up with the words. Silence before a word actually heightens attention to what comes following the silence, heightens attention to the word. Silence is used differently in countries around the world. In China, silence is meant to indicate respect. If you're hearing from somebody who's upset with you, you don't respond by explaining yourself. You stay silent. It's showing respect in China. In the United States, silence indicates being upset. We even have a phrase for it, right? I'm getting the silent treatment from my wife. She's mad at me. I'm getting the silent treatment from somebody else because we had an argument and it didn't go well. Silent in the United States often indicates being upset. In Mexico, customer service is very interesting to watch. If you see somebody who's upset in a bank or a cell phone store and they start to raise their voice, Mexicans, I don't even want to say rarely yell. I have never seen a Mexican person yell. They just don't yell. And so when you start to get to be an agitated customer, you're going to be greeted by silence with Mexico. And Mexican people, generally speaking, they just shut down when somebody's aggressive and angry. They're not used to that. So that's what silence is indicating, that they're reaching their limit with you. And they may end up just walking away from the desk and not even pretending to hear you anymore. Next up is haptics as a type of nonverbal communication. Haptics is the use of touch and the way that we touch other people. Again, this is all changing in the pandemic. Who knows where we're going? But prior to the pandemic, in Thailand, it's rude to touch a child on the top of the head, whereas in Italy, that would be very, very common. In Thailand, it's rude to do that because the head is the home of the soul, and you're touching that child's soul. Mediterranean cultures, which are those cultures that are along the Med, not just Italy, Spain, France, Portugal, but also the other side of the Mediterranean, Africa. We talk about Egypt, we talk about Algeria, we talk about Morocco. Touching is understood to be a common occurrence. You should be touching people all the time. Germanic cultures, and when I say that, I mean Germany. I'm also speaking about Holland, although Dutch people would not be that happy to be called a Germanic culture, but we're talking about the root of the language for the societies and Teutonic peoples. They hardly touch each other at all. They have very standoff approaching. In the U.S., touch is fairly common. We touch people's shoulders, arms. In sports, we give people a swat on the butt. That's commonly accepted in the sports arena, but you sure wouldn't do that to a student in a classroom, right? So haptics is very different across the world. Next up is artifactual communication. Artifactual communication is the arrangement of objects in your household and how those objects communicate dimensions of you as a person and also your culture. If you go into the average American household, you will find, at least if the household has been set up by the female in the house, and this is an acknowledged stereotype here because males can do it, but in my experience it's more often than females, you will see lots of family photos. Think about your home. When you walk in, do you have family photos? In other cultures, such as Japan, that's a private matter and that should be kept in the bedroom. And so arranging things is a way of artifactual communication. And a lot of the arranging has to do with the clothing that we wear. You know, in the United States, it's very typical to wear branded clothing. I've got a shirt here today. It'd be very difficult for me to go out and buy, quote unquote, a polo shirt, which you need to play golf. Very difficult to buy one that doesn't have a brand on it. This one, Columbia. We wear brands all the time, Hollister, Nike, and so on and so on. We're very happy. We're like walking advertising, even though we're not getting paid for it. That's another subject, right? But we're very, very commonly expressing our endorsement of corporate logos when we range our artifactual clothing around ourselves. If you go into Mexican households, you're going to see in almost every household an Our Lady of Guadalupe, their patron saint. It's a more important saint in Mexico than in anywhere else in the world, Our Lady of Guadalupe. And Mexico is said to be more Catholic than Rome. And you don't just find, little trinkets of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Sometimes you go into a Mexican house and they have a whole part of the wall that is carved out, this cavity with this arch at the top. And the Lady of Guadalupe is right in that wall. You go into Danish households, a country I haven't talked about so far, they have a lot of wood, like what you see behind me. But that wood is going to be treated with not a polyurethane like we use here in the United States, which sits on top, but by a Danish oil, which seeps into the wood and preserves it. A lot of that comes from the fact that they're just around shipbuilding and ship faring all the time. It's a country that's right there on Copenhagen, safe harbor. That's what Copenhagen means. So Danish households present a lot of wood. And finally, we have the type of nonverbal communication called olfactics. Olfactics, which is your olfactory sense. It's your nose, right? The Romans were obsessed with roses. They put roses everywhere. They believed that it imbued the air with a scent and smell that would encourage peacefulness, reflection, and overall good feeling. And in fact, the whole idea of aromatherapy is something that's widely practiced in American households today, even though it's coming mostly from Egypt, India, and China. It's the idea of putting smells into the house to help keep the house have a certain environment, not just for the niceness of the smell. And there is a slew of products in the United States that you can plug into electrical outlets to create smells. My wife uses some kind of bowl-shaped thing on the kitchen counter. You can tell by my nonverbals, right? I'm not a big believer in this. And it's putting out some kind of cold steam that has a scent in the house that's supposed to keep things calm. I'll let you know if that works. So aromatherapy is a great example of olfactics. And in fact, advertisers, they push olfactics all the time in their country. They've actually got us believing that a person's natural body smell is odorous and it needs to be covered up with deodorant and perfume and cologne and body spray and et cetera, et cetera. So all these smells, by the way, created by chemicals, but it's part of the way of getting people to buy those products, to get them to feel that they are in an unhealthy environment, an unclean environment, if it doesn't smell a certain way that we're convinced to believe. All right, so there is the chapter on nonverbal communication. It ends with a couple case studies. I'd like you to dig into those. You've got the case study on the Y in Thailand, very interesting about nonverbals there. And then more to the point for if you're a U.S. citizen, there's a case study on Korean American businesses, which you may or may not have encountered. A lot of Korean American businesses in California. There are some in New York. And it's very interesting the relationships that go on between customers and owners in that business relationship. I hope you enjoy nonverbal communication. The last thing I'd like to say to you is